In the aftermath of our victory earlier that spring, the summer of 2007 ushered in a new generation of staff and parent leaders. Reaching that policy victory took everything we had. It was game-changing, and attrition was definitely to be expected. It was a rebuilding period that ended up being an incredible opportunity to see whether or not CADRE's vision of ending the school-to-prison pipeline would resonate beyond our founding leaders. We had learned a lot about what our North Star required of us. So we went back to basics, solidifying our organizing work plans, focusing on outreach and recruitment, and identifying a new generation of core leaders. We were graced, as always, by the continued leadership of Roslyn Bridenex, who was yet to leave CADRE's side. This time, we had a lot more to share with parents when we knocked on doors. Our objective in the spring of 2008 was to carry out our own parent awareness campaign, to involve parents in monitoring before their children got suspended, to hold another forum for community understanding that created independent eyes and ears for monitoring whether LAUSD's new discipline policy was being implemented. This was a lot to do with the new staff and parent members, but through trial and error we recruited, held a small rally, informed the press, and started to engage other organizations as allies. We wanted everyone to raise their expectations for how school discipline would be handled and scrutinized going forward. We had waited patiently more than a year after the policy's adoption to give LAUSD time to fully implement, while we tilled the soil in the meantime. But at the beginning of the following school year, we embarked on the first year of training parents to monitor whether school-wide positive behavior support was being implemented, specifically in South LA schools, where it was needed the most to break the tide of massive school pushout, especially of Black students, through suspensions and involuntary transfers. We adapted our tradition of designing parent action research to test out different survey formats. And most importantly, we submitted a public records request, the first ever, for evidence of school discipline practices and parent involvement. We were laying the groundwork to develop what's known in the human rights movement as a shadow report, our version of the truth. We knew it would inevitably counter the school district's narrative. We stepped things up and began designing the research for the shadow report. We went back to door-to-door surveying and recruiting parents to meetings to collect more surveys and testimony, as well as train and mobilize parents to do classroom observations of the social emotional climate and behavioral support practices inside South LA classrooms. This was also new ground, and we took tremendous care to support our parents from backlash. We also recognized a major political reality. When we switched from talking about the problem to implementing a solution like SWPBIS in real life, there was a longer road to consensus among parents. What to do instead of a suspension, especially among families who had yet to experience one, was more varied and driven by very personal and individualized interests. This meant that we had to slow down and unpack things and take more time for consensus. And it was going to take data, political education, reframing, and a narrative shift. So we decided to do a community report of what our findings were by June 2009 as an interim step towards our full shadow report in June 2010. It soon became clear how thoughtful we needed to be. It wasn't just a matter of conducting surveys and then tabulating the results. Monitoring school discipline practices, with parents collecting the data, was a strategic exercise of parent power, and it started us on our journey of redefining what parent power meant, what it could be. By the spring of 2009, we were essentially conducting a research project and utilizing the entire process to simultaneously train parents on their human rights, on understanding the LAUSD discipline policy and specifically school-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports, training them on how to determine whether it was being implemented, and if it wasn't, how to document and frame what was happening instead. At every turn, we had to prepare for the oppositional arguments, the ones that justified a zero-tolerance approach, justified kicking kids out of class and school, justified blaming and judging their parents. Our choir was too small to just preach to it. We had to find a way to get everyone to see that a proactive, positive, preventive, and restorative approach to school discipline in South LA was essential to addressing inequitable educational outcomes by race. We began to prepare to go to the school board again in June 2009, highlighting the need for LAUSD to begin implementing the new discipline policy by first focusing on actions they needed to take to be accountable, accessible, and transparent to and with parents during implementation. We mobilized another protest in front of the school board, this time using duct tape over people's mouths to symbolize the silencing of the voices of students who were pushed out and their parents. We did part of our protest in silence and were joined by dozens of young people who were willing to wear signs on their backs representing themselves or their peers who were pushed out of school. We didn't always get a lot of media at our actions, but we kept going back, framing the issue and making it public. As always, the important thing was to apply pressure and have the district see parents, making implementation, or the lack thereof, a constant issue. To have them see organized parents, visibly monitoring, and rigorously looking for and examining evidence of implementation, if there was any. To have them see parents not sitting back and waiting, not satisfied by a policy victory. Along the way, as we were doing all of this, in the spring of 2008, we had begun a collaboration with New World Education and Manla Kaise that has continued to this day. We asked Manla to adapt his model student retention and self-empowerment framework for parents so that parents could apply the same tools to their own self-empowerment as advocates for their children. We wanted to make sure that while we were stopping school pushout on the policy and practice side, that we were doing our best to support our parents in making sure their own children did not fall through the cracks. We started off conducting 2 cycles of 8-week sessions of what we call the Parent Educational Empowerment Academy, and by the fall of 2009, we had fully converted this partnership with Manla into the gateway activity for new parents. The Academy was the first stop, where parents invested in themselves, understanding their own power, utilizing practical tools to be holistic advocates for their children and themselves, built community with other parents, and were introduced to CADRE's work and North Star. Each year, our goal was and has been to contact several hundred new parents to recruit Academy participants who graduate and become members and core leaders. We began having 2 tracks of intensive work, the Academy process for new parents and our campaign work with our core leaders. We were still analyzing our survey results and getting ready for the most complex report we had ever done. Incredibly, a 3rd track started to emerge at the exact same time. After our 2007 policy victory, we had started to co-found a national coalition based on CADRE's unique model called the Dignity in Schools campaign. And at the end of 2009, we began to mobilize organizations around the country to sign on to a national resolution to end school pushout. When we turned the corner to 2010, we were in the home stretch of finishing our first ever shadow report of CADRE's findings on whether or not school-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports, aka SWPBIS, were specifically being implemented in South LA schools. It was extremely hard work. We had done this level of participatory analysis with parents before, but this report had high stakes. We benefited from the intensive partnership we had with public interest attorneys Laura Fair and Ruth Cusick, and graduate students like Brian Ventura, all of whom helped us narrow down our focus to the most important findings revealed by the data, and to engage parents critically at meetings. We were serious, but we also mixed it up. Our local allies in the Dignity in Schools campaign, Los Angeles Coalition, pulled together for the first of its kind car march, highlighting the school pushout crisis and what our organizations were demanding as remedies. 30-plus cars caravan from South LA to the school district downtown to create neighborhood awareness. It was unique, it was creative, with the car flags and all. Definitely a sight to see. The report was the result of many sources of data. We had conducted nearly 400 parent surveys about their awareness of the new discipline policy, as well as what they observed about the school discipline practices that were supposed to change with SWPBIS. We were helped out by our sister organization, Community Coalition, with the collection of over 400 high school youth surveys. We had organized a handful of parents to pilot classroom-based observations of discipline practices. Those were harder than we expected. We had reviewed nearly 70 individual school binders with whatever evidence they could produce in response to our public records request, including sign-in sheets and agendas for parent meetings, faculty meetings, and professional development about SWP/S. Discipline data broken down by race, gender, and grade level as much as possible. Anything that related to the 8 pillars of SWP/S. We indexed every piece of paper in every binder so that we could compare South LA schools in Local District 7 with one another on a scale and determine which schools were implementing the most to the least. We also conducted site visits to 2 South LA schools whose binders made it evident that they had been implementing SWP/S well before it was mandated and that they had extremely positive results. We concluded that almost all of the South LA schools in Local District 7 were failing at implementation. This wasn't new news. Implementation is the ultimate test of political will to make wholesale change. But we were naming schools, grading them, and pointing out specifically where and how they were failing. Again, high stakes. No one had done such a report, let alone from a grassroots, independent community viewpoint, let alone from parents. But it was our commitment to leveraging the human rights framework to reshape the narrative around school pushout and punitive school discipline, to bring it to the forefront of the public education debate. We had evidence, and we had courage. On June 15, 2010, our shadow report was featured as a plenary session of the annual convening of the U.S. Human Rights Fund, which happened to be in Los Angeles that year. The fund was one of CADRE's earliest funders of this work, and this provided our parents a national forum in which to share our findings, recommendations, and call to action. We took the bold step of inviting numerous administrators from across the school district to hear our presentation. As expected, there was discomfort in the room. But it was our parents who were on that stage speaking, our printed report in everyone's hands, and our data that backed up the ground truth, the truth that everyone knew was happening but had been accepting as status quo. We issued our call to action for authentic, transparent, accountable implementation, with parents as central partners. We knew that if schools changed their operating systems around behavioral support, it very well would require us to hold on to and support the students and families that were viewed as the most expendable. It would force us to confront systemic anti-Black racism in the way that impacts all of us. Tune in to our next video covering the years 2010 to 2013, when our movement building takes off and we win another major policy that profoundly changes school discipline.